What's up, everyone? And welcome back to Loreplay. I'm Dayna Pereira, and we are officially in Mardi Gras season, which means, spiritually and emotionally, my boobs are in NOLA. Not getting beads, though, because my mom might listen to this episode. Have you guys ever been to New Orleans? I've been a few times now, and I fucking love it. I love the cemetery walks and the beignets and the Aaron Rose frozen Irish coffee. Oh, and the dancing at Razoo's and the absolute debauchery that we cause when we are in that city. It feels like you're in another timeline. Like you get to be this version of yourself that is so carefree and fun and light. I mean, at least for me, that's how I feel whenever I'm there. Truly, I think some of the best times of my adult life have been in NOLA with my sister and a group of girlfriends. There's just something about that city and that group of girls that just fucking revives my soul. And two of those friends just recently lost their father pretty suddenly, and my heart is just fucking crushed for them and for their family. And I mean, there's obviously nothing a podcast episode can do to fix that kind of loss. Grief doesn't give a shit about spooky storytelling. But I do think that collectively, maybe we can all hold some space for them. Maybe we can send some loving energy their way. And whether you believe in energy spiritually or emotionally, I really do believe that it travels. John was a hell of a guy. He was funny as shit and a blast to be around and a rock for my family through our own grief not too long ago. And I'm so grateful that I got to know him. So whether they ever hear this episode or not, I am taking our collective vibes to the place that always lifted us up. I want to imagine them walking down Bourbon Street, Aaron Rose in hand, giggling about the fucking shit we caused the night before. And if that energy gives them even the smallest lift, then it's worth it. John, you are so loved, and you're going to be so deeply missed. And to the family, I fucking love you all so much. And now that I'm crying my freshly done makeup off, let's fucking take our asses to New Orleans before I fully lose my shit. Okay, I'm gonna take a break. Hold on. Whew, okay. Well, through the magic of editing, I have now pulled my shit together and dried my face. Okay. So, like I was saying, let's take our asses to New Orleans. Now, if you've ever wandered around the French Quarter, you've almost definitely walked past this house. And if you're a ghost tour girly, or boily, you may have paid money to stand outside it while someone whispers dramatically. The LaLaurie Mansion isn't some hidden haunted gem. It's famous as hell, and for all the wrong reasons. Because once we're done here, you're going to realize something deeply uncomfortable. People with money and status have always hidden unimaginable atrocities. A gazillion years ago, and still now. The LaLaurie Mansion has a history so dark, it almost didn't have a choice but to be haunted. But before we get to the mansion itself, we need context. And not boring context. We need New Orleans context. Because this city has always been a little bit unhinged, hence the reason I fucking love it so much. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, Louisiana bounced between French and Spanish control. It wasn't even a U.S. state until 1812. Catholicism was dominant. Social status was everything. And slavery wasn't just legal, it was foundational to the economy. This was a society built on appearances, power, hierarchy, and an absolutely Olympic level commitment to people minding their own business, which is how evil tends to thrive. Evil loves nothing more than people who turn their heads the other way. In fact, it counts on it. Marie Delphine McCarty was born March 19th, 1787, and she didn't grow up adjacent to power. She grew up inside of it. Her family was part of New Orleans' old Creole elite. That meant land, money, enslaved people, and political connections baked in from birth. She was educated, multilingual, reportedly beautiful, which is subjective, and more importantly, she was raised to understand something very early. Rules were flexible, consequences were negotiable, and status protected you. It's giving entitled little bitch, but, that's speculation. At 13 years old, because history is a fucking nightmare, Delphine marries a Spanish royal officer named Don Ramon. Actually, his full name was Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, but that felt like a lot, so I shortened it to Don Ramon. And I just want to pause for a second and say, thank fuck we all collectively decided that marrying children is in fact horrifying and illegal. This marriage elevated her status even further and tied her directly to the Spanish colonial government. In 1804, they're called to Madrid on business, and somewhere along the way, Havana specifically, Don Ramon dies. Now, Delphine is full-ass pregnant at this point, has a daughter, and has to return home with her baby to Louisiana, a widow. And here's where the narrative locks in, because she is now a young, beautiful, and wealthy widow. In New Orleans society, that's not a tragedy. It's a glow-up. People felt sorry for her. They protected her. They excused things. Sympathy wrapped around her like armor. And that sympathy shield would matter more than anyone realized. A few years later, Delphine did exactly what women of her class were expected to do. She remarries. Jeanne Blanc was not a romantic choice so much as a strategic one. In early 19th century New Orleans, Blanc's name carried weight. He moved easily through the overlapping worlds of banking, law, commerce, and politics. Industries that didn't just generate money, but controlled who had access to it. He was the kind of man who knew where land would be valuable before anyone else did, who understood credit and debt in a city that ran on both, and who belonged to the tight circle of men who quietly shaped New Orleans from behind desks and dining tables. For Delphine, still young but already once widowed, the marriage was a reset. Her first husband's death had earned her sympathy. Marrying Blanc converted that sympathy into stability and insulation. She was no longer a tragic figure people whispered about. She was a respectable wife again, anchored to one of the city's most connected men. In a society obsessed with appearances, this mattered more than almost anything else. Their marriage appeared calm, prosperous, and conventional. Delphine ran a household befitting her status, and together they had 4 children, adding to the daughter she already had from her first marriage. By the standards of the time, she embodied exactly what elite New Orleans wanted to see: a devoted mother, a composed hostess, and a woman firmly placed within the boundaries of acceptable society. But beneath that surface, something quieter and more consequential was happening. Louisiana's legal system, shaped by French and Spanish civil law rather than English common law, allowed married women more property rights than many of their counterparts elsewhere in the United States. During her marriage to Blanc, Delphine became familiar with contracts, property ownership, and financial autonomy. She wasn't merely benefiting from her husband's influence. She was learning how to operate within it. And then, in 1816, Jean Blanc dies. And some of you might be thinking, 2 husbands that have died sounds suspicious. And, for our era, yeah, super sus. But for back then, kind of normal. There was no scandal, no public suspicion, and no suggestion of wrongdoing. His death was recorded plainly, treated as unfortunate but unremarkable. He wasn't elderly, but he was a man of his era, living in a city where illness was common and life expectancy was unpredictable. Society responded to Delphine's second widowhood the same way it had the first time, with condolences, sympathy, and protection. When Delphine married for a third time, she did so from a very different position than when she had entered her first 2 unions. She was no longer a young bride shaped by expectation or circumstance. She was a twice widowed woman in her late 30s, wealthy in her own right, legally experienced, socially protected, and fully aware of how forgiving New Orleans society could be, especially to someone like her. Her third husband was Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie, a physician whose name carried professional respect, but nowhere near the social gravity of Jean Blanc's. And the imbalance mattered. For the first time, Delphine married a man who did not elevate her status. If anything, the power dynamic tilted decisively in her favor. Leonard LaLaurie was a doctor in an era when medicine hovered uncomfortably between science and superstition. Physicians were respected, but their methods were often invasive, experimental, and brutal by modern standards. Surgery was performed without anesthesia. Bloodletting was still common. Pain was considered inevitable, even instructive. This was a profession that normalized suffering in the name of treatment. Unlike her previous marriages, this one appeared strained. Allegedly, the couple lived increasingly separate lives, and Leonard himself seems to fade from the historical record as Delphine's influence expands. Whether he was frequently absent, deliberately disengaged, or simply overshadowed by his wife is unclear. But what is clear is that Delphine retained control of property, of the household, and of the enslaved people who lived within it. It was during this marriage that Delphine purchased and began living at 1140 Royal Street. And that house is important, not just as a location, but as a character. The home was elegant and imposing, positioned in the heart of the French Quarter, a physical symbol of her wealth and refinement. To neighbors and visitors, the house appeared no different from others lining the street. Inside, Delphine hosted gatherings, attended church, and continued cultivating the image she had spent her entire adult life perfecting. If you met her in public, nothing would suggest what was happening behind closed doors. Which, duh. Now, I'm not saying that all squeaky clean people are monsters, but I am saying that a lot of monsters try to appear to be squeaky clean. But behind those doors, people started noticing something off. Rumors started circulating quietly, Not shouted, they moved the way gossip always does in places built on hierarchy. Sideways, whispered, careful not to land on the wrong ears. And the rumors were downright fucking crazy. Neighbors reported hearing screaming late at night, most often from the upper levels of the house. Sounds described as panicked and inhuman. These weren't drunken revelers or rowdy parties. These were screams that were blood-curdling. You know how you can definitely tell a difference between someone play screaming like they're in a tickle fight and someone screaming because they're being chased with a machete? That. Locals noticed enslaved people seen bruised, bandaged, limping, or visibly terrified, only to disappear entirely days later. New servants would appear without explanation, while previous ones were never seen again. The rumor wasn't just that servants were dying, it was that they were being disposed of quietly, without record, burial, or acknowledgement. One such rumor was about a cook and laundress and her 4 children, aged 13, 10, 6, and 2. The rumor goes that Delphine was punishing one of the children. The mom stepped in, and they all ended up dead. Now, is there proof? No. But once you hear the rest of the rumors, it's not hard to imagine that it could be true. The thing about rumors is that if there's just the one, it can be written off or a misunderstanding. But if there's, say, 38,000, the likelihood of some of those rumors being true increases by a lot. Entire sections of the mansion, particularly the attic, were strictly off limits. Delphine LaLaurie reportedly kept keys on her person at all times, and servants who asked questions were punished. Neighbors speculated those rooms were being used for prolonged confinement, medical experiments, and punishments that went far beyond whipping. The attic, in particular, became the focus of whispered dread. Court records from that time show that Delphine LaLaurie did, on paper, free 2 enslaved people. One named Jean-Louis in 1819, and another named De Vince in 1832. And on the surface, that looks decent, I guess. I mean, if you're skimming records and doing the bare fucking minimum, it almost gives the, see, she wasn't that bad kind of energy. But context matters a lot, because freeing 2 people over more than a decade doesn't erase the fact that rumors about her cruelty were already widespread throughout New Orleans. Widespread enough that the city felt compelled to do that thing institutions love to do, send one guy to politely check on it. According to contemporary accounts, a local lawyer was dispatched to the Royal Street Mansion to remind LaLaurie, gently and respectfully, about the laws governing the treatment of enslaved people. And when he inspected the house, he found nothing. No evidence, no wrongdoing, no visible mistreatment, which sounds reassuring until you remember how often abuse survives precisely because it knows how to hide. And this is where the official record ends and the whispered stories begin. British writer Harriet Martineau, who later documented local accounts, wrote that after this visit, after LaLaurie had essentially been given a heads up that eyes were on her, something happened that the neighborhood never forgot. A neighbor reportedly witnessed a young enslaved girl fall from the roof of the mansion. Some accounts say she was 8 years old, others say 12, but she wasn't playing and she wasn't wondering. She was running from Delphine LaLaurie. The story goes that she was brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, which enraged Delphine. Now, side note, Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess in episode 12, was also enraged in the exact same way. A servant hitting a snag while brushing her hair. Just a parallel that I wanted to point out there. So the girl hits a snag, Delphine loses her shit and starts chasing her with a whip as punishment. The girl was so scared that rather than go back inside that house, she climbed to the roof. And then she fell. Later accounts would name the girl as Leah, and whether every detail is accurate or not, the core of the story remains consistent across retellings. A child was so terrified of punishment that she either chose death instead or fell to death because of it. Her body, according to multiple accounts, was buried on the mansion grounds. This incident finally forced a more serious investigation. And isn't it how it always goes? Something fucking truly terrible has to happen before someone finally says, maybe we should listen to those rumors. And this time, Delphine LaLaurie was found guilty of illegal cruelty. The punishment? They were ordered to forfeit 9 enslaved people from their household. And now, here's the part that really tells you everything you need to know about how this system worked. Those 9 people didn't go free. They were purchased back by the LaLauries through an intermediary relative and quietly returned to the mansion. Same house, same owner, same walls. And Delphine LaLaurie learned once again the same lesson she'd been learning her whole life. Even when you're caught, if you have enough money, enough status, and enough silence around you, you don't really lose anything at all. Until April 10th, 1834. Now this is the moment where New Orleans stops whispering, finally, and starts screaming back. We're on Royal Street in the French Quarter. The air is already thick because it's New Orleans and it always is. But tonight, it smells wrong. Smoke. Panic. Fires in New Orleans weren't exactly rare. Hot kitchens, open flames, old buildings. I mean, they happened. But this one felt different. When firefighters and city officials arrived at the LaLaurie Mansion, they were met with something that should have set off alarm bells immediately. Delphine refused to let them in. She insisted the fire was under control. She blocked access to parts of the house. She delayed. She argued, which is a bold move when your house is literally on fire. Now, let me say that again slowly, because it matters. A house is actively on fire. People are actively inside. And this bitch is actively preventing rescue. Firefighters have to force their way through the mansion, and they eventually discovered why the fire had started. The cook, an elderly enslaved woman, had intentionally set it. She later admitted she did it because she was attempting suicide, because she was terrified of being taken upstairs. Because, according to her, once you went upstairs, you didn't come back the same, if at all. She had been chained to the stove. Chained to the motherfucking stove. She told them that she would rather die in a fire than be taken to the upper rooms of that house. And at that point, the firefighters did what Delphine had been desperately trying to prevent. They broke down doors. They climbed stairs that no one outside the household had been allowed to climb in years. And when they reached the locked upper rooms Delphine had insisted no one enter. They found something that made hardened men physically recoil. They found people alive, barely. Enslaved men and women were discovered chained, restrained, suspended, and confined in conditions described as horrifying. Bodies were emaciated, wounds were visible. Some had iron collars. Others were bound in positions that made movement impossible. This wasn't punishment or discipline. This was prolonged suffering. Witnesses later described people who appeared to have been held there for months, possibly years. They were not hidden by accident. They were deliberately concealed, locked away, forgotten by everyone except the people who put them there. And here's where the rumors of medical experimentation explode into the story. Because what first responders saw didn't make sense within the framework of normal cruelty of the time. And that's a fucked up sentence to even say out loud, but it's true. The restraints weren't about stopping escape. They were about endurance, about limiting movement for long periods. Some bodies showed signs of repeated injury, wounds that had been healed and then reopened. Muscles that had wasted in unnatural ways, limbs held in positions that would cause permanent damage over time. People looked at that and thought, what the fuck were they doing to them? And then someone remembered something very important. Delphine LaLaurie's husband was a doctor. Now, let's pause here for a second because this is where we need to be responsible and honest. There is no surviving medical documentation proving that Delphine or her husband conducted formal medical experiments. There are no journals, no notes, no confessions, nothing that would pass off as like a modern standard of evidence. But medicine in the early 1800s was already a nightmare. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, surgery done with speed instead of mercy. And experimentation, especially on enslaved people, was common, unregulated, and rarely questioned. That part is not rumor. That is documented history. Enslaved people were used for medical practice across the United States. Their bodies were considered property, their pain irrelevant, their consent non-existent. So when firefighters and officials found people restrained in ways that didn't align with labor or punishment, when injuries appeared methodical rather than impulsive, the public filled in the blanks. Newspapers described bodies so damaged that readers assumed experimentation had to be involved. Later, writers went further, describing alleged attempts to alter bodies, test endurance, or prolong suffering intentionally. With each retelling, the details grew a little more grotesque. Some of that is almost certainly exaggeration, but here's the part people miss. You don't need a scalpel to destroy a human body. Prolonged starvation changes anatomy. Repeated injury rewires the nervous system. Forced immobility reshapes muscles and bones. Psychological terror leaves scars. And Delphine's behavior didn't help her case. She had gone out of her way to hide these rooms. She resisted entry. She isolated the victims. And when exposed, she didn't explain. Word spreads instantly. People flood Royal Street, not curiosity, rage. The rescued enslaved people are carried out to doctors attempting to help them. Crowds line up, not to gawk, but to bear witness, because suddenly the rumors make sense. The screams, the disappearances, the child who fell from the roof. the servants who never came back? This wasn't gossip. This was evidence. At the time they were discovered, most of the attic victims were alive, but some of them didn't survive much longer. Their bodies too damaged, too weak, and too far gone. They died shortly after rescue. And those deaths were a direct result of LaLaurie's abuse and cruelty. Once word spread about what had been found inside the LaLaurie Mansion, New Orleans snapped. And not in a poetic way, more in a mob justice way, which makes you wonder, why did these people turn their head for years, but now all of a sudden want loud justice? What changed? I'll tell you what changed. It was now very public and very in your face. Apparently, once proof was undeniable, they were ready to prosecute the woman they once protected and adored. Now, present-day people, maybe take note. People surged into the house. Furniture was dragged into the street and smashed. Chairs, cabinets, mirrors, just torn apart and burned like kindling. Windows shattered, walls were damaged. Anything that could be destroyed was destroyed. And it wasn't just rage. This was panic. Because the crowd wasn't just reacting to Delphine. They were reacting to the realization that they had known enough to stop it. And they didn't. Probably a pretty shitty feeling to know that you 100% could have said something when it was just rumors, but stuck your head in the sand anyways. Accounts described the discovery of human remains on the grounds, although the only confirmed one was of Leah, the little girl who fell from the roof. But the fact that more were not found doesn't mean that they never existed. Which brings us to Delphine herself. Because while the city was tearing her house apart, this bitch was already gone. Accounts differ on exactly how she escaped. Some say she fled by carriage under cover of confusion. Others suggest she slipped away quietly while attention was focused on the house. But what is clear is this. Delphine LaLaurie did not stay to face consequences. She vanished. No arrest, no trial, no sentencing. Just a maddening injustice for a woman that doesn't know the meaning of consequence. She is believed to have fled to France, where she lived out the rest of her life far from Royal Street. Records of her death are vague and disputed. Some place it in Paris in the 1840s. Others suggest she lived longer. And nothing pisses the Aries in me off more than this woman living out the rest of her days in Paris snacking on a fucking croissant. The people found in her house were taken to a building that was basically like a town hall, where thousands of citizens reportedly came to see them. Not to help, but to look. Even in exposure, they were treated as objects, evidence of scandal rather than victims of atrocity. And once the spectacle faded, well, everyone just moved on. The mansion was left a ruined shell, its elegance stripped away, its walls scorched, its name poisoned. And here's where the story stops being just history and starts getting absolutely dragged through the folklore mud. Because what people think they know about the LaLaurie Mansion, that didn't all show up in the newspapers in 1834. A lot of it showed up later, layer by layer, storyteller by storyteller. During the 19th century, stories about Delphine were already circulating across Louisiana. People talk, and gossip that juicy is definitely going to be whispered throughout every dinner party. Eventually, those stories made their way into print. Writers like Henry Castellanos and George Washington Cable collected and reprinted the tales, drawing from newspaper reports and earlier first-hand accounts, including Harriet Martineau. Now, Cable didn't just copy-paste history, he stitched things together. He filled in gaps. He added dialogue, interpretation, and his own narrative flair. Important note, it wasn't done maliciously. This was super normal for the time. But it did mean the line between documented fact and storytelling started to blur. After World War II, the LaLaurie story took a sharp turn into full-on horror. In 1946, a writer named Jean de Levine published Ghost Stories of Old New Orleans. And this is where the imagery goes from disturbing to straight up cinematic. She says that Delphine had a, and I quote, sadistic appetite that seemed never appeased until she had inflicted on one or more of her black servitors some hideous form of torture. She alleged that when firefighters broke in, they found, and seriously, brace yourself for this quote, male slaves, stark naked, chained to the wall, their eyes gouged out, their fingernails pulled off by the roots. Others had their joints skinned and festering, great holes in their buttocks where the flesh had been sliced away, their ears hanging by shreds, their lips sewn together. Intestines were pulled out and knotted around naked waists. There were holes in skulls where a rough stick had been inserted to stir the brains. Now, that is some fucking stark imagery. It's important to note that it's backed up by absolutely nothing. Like, there's literally zero sources cited and nothing documented described anything close to that. But damn. And since we're on the let's embellish the shit out of this story train, let's fast forward to 1998. A New Orleans ghost tour operator, Kalila Katharina Smith, publishes Journey into Darkness, Ghosts and Vampires of New Orleans. Her retelling adds even more colorful aspects. And here I go with my quoting again, because according to Kalila, there was a, quote, victim who obviously had her arms amputated and her skin peeled off in a circular pattern, making her look like a human caterpillar, and another who had her limbs broken and reset at odd angles so she resembled a human crab. Now, again, absolutely no evidence to support this, but what a fucking story, especially for a woman making her living as a ghost tour operator. You know that phrase, sex sells? Kind of like that, maybe, except swap sex for horrific gore. After the fire, the house was basically radioactive. It sat vacant for years, but not forever. Over the decades, the building was repeatedly repurposed. A school, a music conservatory, a bar, which, side note, please turn it into a bar again. I am dying to go inside. A furniture store, apartments, and a boarding house for immigrants. That pattern is important because owners consistently avoided making it a single-family residence, almost like people sensed that sleeping there, alone, at night, was a bad idea. Records show owners frequently sold the property after relatively brief periods. Some cited financial reasons, others didn't explain at all. But oral histories filled in the gaps. Across centuries and unrelated occupants, people reported screaming, often described as coming from the upper floors or the courtyard. Chains clanking even when no one was upstairs. Footsteps pacing back and forth late at night. cold spots that lingered in specific rooms, apparitions, especially figures believed to be enslaved victims, and a persistent smell, sometimes described as rot or smoke, that comes and goes without explanation. And that would definitely do it for me, because have you ever walked past a dead animal on the street? That smell of death is very specific and very no thank you. One story claims a young tenant was found dead in an upstairs room under mysterious circumstances. Though, much like the LaLaurie lore, documentation fades and whispers take over. It seems like a lot of the people and businesses that occupied the premises had a whole lot of bad luck. By the early 1900s, the mansion was notorious enough that locals warned newcomers about it. It was known as the haunted house on Royal Street long before ghost tours monetized fear. In the mid-20th century, it again served as apartments. Residents complained of nightmares shared by multiple tenants. Like, could you imagine the eeriness of having the same nightmare as someone else? It's fucking creepy. They felt watched and said objects moved on their own. Now, again, people didn't stay. In 2007, Nicolas Cage purchased the mansion for around $3.45 million. This was during Cage's wildly ambitious real estate era, a time when he was basically buying anything with a roof and a vibe. And apparently, one of those vibes was notoriously cursed New Orleans murder house. Now, here's the anticlimax. Despite owning it, Nicolas Cage never actually lived in the mansion. In 2009, the mansion was foreclosed on after he defaulted on some loans tied to several properties. So his tenure as owner of America's most infamous homes lasted roughly 2 years. In 2010, Michael Whalen purchased the property for roughly $2.1 million, which honestly feels like a bargain if you're comfortable owning one of the most infamous addresses in American history. The mansion is a private residence, but it's not used as a full-time home. No permanent occupants, no family living inside, no owner casually making coffee in the kitchen while every ghost tour guide pauses dramatically outside. The house has been heavily renovated, structurally restored, and modernized inside, which kind of bums me out, but, I guess not my circus, not my monkeys. It's also been kept very, very private. You can't tour it or go inside. Over the years, the mansion has popped up in the news now and then, like rumors of listings or whispers of sales, big price tags floating around. But as of the most recent confirmed information, Michael Whalen still remains the owner. I'm willing to bet that if and when that house sells, Mr. Whalen will have made quite the profit. So I guess the home isn't bad luck for everyone. Although, who knows? I don't know his life. The LaLaurie Mansion isn't just a haunted house story. It's a reminder of how cruelty can hide behind chandeliers and social status. How turning our heads when we know something horrible is happening makes us complicit. And how places tied to real human suffering don't always let us forget. Now, I am not typically outwardly political on this show, although I do tend to weave in the vibes. But if you are a person that says, oh, I'm not political or I don't do politics, one, how nice for you that you have the privilege of not having to do politics. But two, if you are a person that is purposely burying your head in the sand, it is time to fucking wake up and stand up. It is time for us to stop turning our heads because it's uncomfortable. It's time to hold the people accountable that think that they are above the law because they have money and social standing. And it's also time to hold the people accountable that think that this shit is okay. What we have in front of us is so much bigger than rumors. We have actual evidence and a leader that is in those files 38,000 times. No more fucking excuses. Stop turning your head. It's not okay. And on that note, that's it for this week's episode. I hope that all of the stories that I tell you remind you that history has done some shit. And we have always elevated. So let's keep elevating together. I am sending you all so much love because, fuck, times are rough. And until next time, maybe let's be on the side of history that doesn't think we should enslave Black people and protect fucking pedophiles. Fuck!